The Pechenyeeg by Anton Pavlovich Chekhov. Ivan Abramich Zhmuhin, a retired Cossack officer who had once served in the Caucasus, but now lived on his own farm, and who had once been young, strong, and vigorous, but now was old, dried up, and bent with shaggy eyebrows, and a greenish-grey mustache, was returning from the town to his farm. One hot summer's day in the town, he had confessed and received absolution, and had made his will at the notary's a fortnight before. He had had a slight stroke, and now all the while he was in the railway carriage, he was haunted by melancholy, serious thoughts of approaching death, of the vanity of vanities, of the transitoriness of all things earthly at the station of Provoliether. Is such a one on the Donets linea? Fair-haired, plump, middle-aged gentleman with a shabby portfolio stepped into the carriage and sat down opposite. They got into conversation. Yes, said Ivan Abramich, looking pensively out of window. It is never too late to marry. I myself married. When I was 48, I was told it was late. But it has turned out that it was not late or early, but simply that it would have been better not to marry at all. Everyone is soon tired of his wife. But not everyone tells the truth, because people are ashamed of an unhappy home life, and conceal its mania this and mania that with many a man by his wife's side. But if he had his way, he'd put that mania in a sack and drop her in the water. It's dull with one's wife, it's mere foolishness. And it's no better with one's children. I make bold to assure you I have two of them, the rascals. There's nowhere for them to be taught out here in the steppe. I haven't the money to send them to school in Novoticherkassk, and they live here like young wolves. Next thing they will be murdering someone on the highroad. The fair-haired gentleman listened attentively, answered questions briefly in a low voice, and was apparently a gentleman of gentle and modest disposition. He mentioned that he was a lawyer, and that he was going to the village Duevka on business. Why, merciful heavens, that is 6 miles from me, said Zhmuhin, in a tone of voice as though someone were disputing with him. But excuse me, you won't find horses at the station now, to my mind. The very best thing you can do, is to come straight to me, stay the night, and in the morning drive over with my horses. The lawyer thought a moment and accepted the invitation. When they reached the station, the sun was already low over the steppe. They said nothing all the way from the station to the farm. The jolting prevented conversation. The trap bounded up and down, squeaked, and seemed to be sobbing, and the lawyer, who was sitting very uncomfortably, stared before him, miserably hoping to see the farm. After they had driven 5 or 6 miles, there came into view in the distance a low-pitched house, and a yard enclosed by a fence made of dark flat stones. Standing on end, the roof was green, the stucco was peeling off, and the windows were little narrow slits like screwed-up eyes. The farm stood in the full sunshine, and there was no sign either of water or trees anywhere round among the neighboring landowners. And the peasants, it was known as the Pechenyegs' farm, many years before a land surveyor who was passing through the neighborhood and put up at the farm spent the whole night talking to Ivan Abramich, was not favorably impressed, and as he was driving away in the morning, said to him grimly, "You are a Pecheneg, my good sir." The Pechenegs were a tribe of wild Mongolian nomads who made frequent inroads upon the Russians in the 10th and 11th centuries. Translator's note. From this came the nickname the Pechenegs' farm, which stuck to the place even more when Zhmuhin's boys grew up and began to make raids on the orchards and kitchen gardens. Ivan Abramich was called, as he usually talked a very great deal, and frequently made use of that expression. In the yard near a barn, Zhmuhin's sons were standing, one a young man of 19, the other a younger lad, both barefoot and bareheaded. Just at the moment when the trap drove into the yard, the younger one flung high up a hen, which, cackling, described an arc in the air. The elder shot at it with a gun, and the hen fell dead on the earth. "Those are my boys learning to shoot birds, flying," said Zhmuhin. In the entry, the travelers were met by a little thin woman with a pale face, still young and beautiful from her dress. She might have been taken for a servant. "And this, allow me to introduce her," said Zhmuhin, "is the mother of my young cubs, come Lyubov Osipovna," he said, addressing her. "You must be spry, mother, and get something for our guest. Let us have supper. Look sharp." The house consisted of 2 parts. In one was the parlor, and beside it old Zhmuhin's bedroom, both stuffy rooms with low ceilings and multitudes of flies and wasps, and in the other was the kitchen, in which the cooking and washing was done, and the laborers had their meals here. Geese and turkehens were sitting on their eggs under the benches, and here were the beds of Lyubov Osipovna and her 2 sons. The furniture in the parlor was unpainted and evidently roughly made by a carpenter. Guns, game bags, and whips were hanging on the walls, and all this old rubbish was covered with the rust of years, and looked gray with dust. There was not one picture in the corner, was a dingy board which had at one time been an icon. A young little Russian woman laid the table and handed ham, then beetroot soup. The visitor refused vodka and ate only bread and cucumbers. How about ham? Asked Zhmuhin. Thank you, I don't eat it, answered the visitor. I don't eat meat at all. Why is that? I am a vegetarian. Killing animals is against my principles. Zhmuhin thought a minute and then said slowly with a sigh. Yes, to be sure, I saw a man who did not eat meat in town too. It's a new religion they've got now. Well, it's good we can't go on always shooting and slaughtering, you know. We must give it up some day. And leave even the beasts in peace. It's a sin to kill, it's a sin. There is no denying it. Sometimes one kills a hare and wounds him in the leg, and he cries like a child, so it must hurt him. Of course it hurts him. Animals suffer, just like human beings. That's true, Zhmuhin assented. I understand that. Very well, he went on, musing. Only there is this one thing I don't understand. Suppose, you know, everyone gave up eating meat. What would become of the domestic animals, fowls and geese, for instance? Fowls and geese would live in freedom like wild birds. Now I understand, to be sure, crows and jackdaws get on all right without us. Yes, fowls and geese and hares and sheep all will live in freedom, rejoicing, you know, and praising God. And they will not fear us. Peace and concord will come. Only, there is one thing, you know, I can't understand. Zhmuhin went on, glancing at the ham. How will it be with the pigs? What is to be done with them? They will be like all the rest, that is, they will live in freedom. Ah, yes, but allow me to say, if they were not slaughtered, they would multiply, you know, and then goodbye to the kitchen gardens. And the meadows. Why, a pig, if you let it free, and don't look after it, will ruin everything in a day. A pig is a pig. And it is not for nothing it is called a pig. They finished supper. Zhmuin got up from the table, and for a long while walked up and down the room, talking and talking. He was fond of talking of something important or serious, and was fond of meditating. And in his old age, he had a longing to reach some haven, to be reassured that he might not be so frightened of dying. He had a longing for meekness, spiritual calm, and confidence in himself, such as this guest of theirs had, who had satisfied his hunger on cucumbers and bread, and believed that doing so made him more perfect. He was sitting on a chest, plump and healthy, keeping silent and patiently enduring his boredom. And in the dusk, when one glanced at him from the entry, he looked like a big round stone, which one could not move from its place. If a man has something to lay hold of in life, he is all right. Zhmuhin went through the entry to the porch, and then he could be heard sighing and saying reflectively to himself, yes, to be sure. By now it was dark in here, and their stars could be seen in the sky. They had not yet lighted up indoors. Someone came into the parlor as noiselessly as a shadow, and stood still near the door. It was Lyubov Osipovna, Zhmuhin's wife. Are you from the town? She asked timidly, not looking at her visitor. Yes, I live in the town. Perhaps you are something in the learned way, sir. Be so kind as to advise us. We ought to send in a petition. To whom? Asked the visitor. We have two sons, kind gentlemen, and they ought to have been sent to school long ago, but we never see anyone and have no one to advise us. And I know nothing, for if they are not taught, they will have to serve in the army as common Cossacks. It's not right, sir, they can't read and write. They are worse than peasants, and Ivan Abramich himself can't stand them and won't let them indoors. But they are not to blame. The younger one, at any rate, ought to be sent to school. It is such a pity, she said slowly, and there was a quiver in her voice, and it seemed incredible that a woman so small and so youthful could have grown-up children. Oh, it's such a pity. You don't know anything about it, mother, and it is not your affair, said Zhmuhin, appearing in the doorway. Don't pester our guest with your wild talk. Go away, mother. Lyubov Osipovna went out, and in the entry repeated once more in a thin little voice, oh, it's such a pity. A bed was made up for the visitor on the sofa in the parlor, and that it might not be dark for him, they lighted the lamp before the icon. Zhmuhin went to bed in his own room, and as he lay there, he thought of his soul, of his age, of his recent stroke which had so frightened him and made him think of death. He was fond of philosophizing when he was in quietness by himself, and then he fancied that he was a very earnest, deep thinker, and that nothing in this world interested him but serious questions, and now he kept thinking, and he longed to pitch upon some one significant thought unlike others, which would be a guide to him in life, and he wanted to think out principles of some sort for himself, so as to make his life as deep and earnest as he imagined that he felt himself to be. It would be a good thing for an old man like him to abstain altogether from meat, from superfluities of all sorts. The time when men give up killing each other, and animals would come sooner or later. It could not but be so, and he imagined that time to himself. and clearly pictured himself living in peace with all the animals, and suddenly he thought again of the pigs, and everything was in a tangle in his brain. It's a queer business, Lord have mercy upon us, he muttered, sighing heavily. Are you asleep? He asked. No. Zhmuin got out of bed and stopped in the doorway with nothing but his shirt on, displaying to his guest his sinewy legs that looked as dry as sticks. Nowadays, he began all sorts of telegraphs, telephones, and marvels of all kinds, in fact, have come in, but people are no better than they were. They say that in our day, 30 or 40 years ago, men were coarse and cruel. But isn't it just the same now? We certainly did not stand on ceremony in our day. I remember in the Caucasus, when we were stationed by a little river, with nothing to do for 4 whole months. I was an under officer at that time. Something queer happened, quite in the style of a novel. Just on the banks of that river, where our division was encamped, a wretched prince whom we had killed not long before was buried. And at night, the princess used to come to his grave and weep. She would wail and wail and moan and moan and make us so depressed we couldn't sleep. And that's the fact, we couldn't sleep one night. We couldn't sleep a second. Well, we got sick of it. And from a common sense point of view, you really can't go without your sleep, for the devil knows what, excuse the expression, we took that princess and gave her a good thrashing. And she gave up coming. There's an instance for you. Nowadays, of course, there is not the same class of people, and they are not given to thrashing, and they live in cleaner style, and there is more learning, but the soul is just the same, there is no change. Now look here, there's a landowner living here among us. He has mines, all sorts of tramps without passports, who don't know where to go work for him on Saturdays. He has to settle up with the workmen, but he doesn't care to pay them. He grudges the money, so he's got hold of a foreman who is a tramp too, though he does wear a hat. Don't you pay them anything? He says, not a kopeck. They'll beat you. And let them beat you, says he, but you put up with it. And I'll pay you 10 rubles every Saturday for it. So on the Saturday evening, the workmen come to settle up in the usual way. The foreman says to them, nothing, well, word for word. As the master said, they begin swearing, and using their fists they beat him, and they kick him. They are a set of men brutalized by hundredth. They beat him till he is senseless, and then they go each on his way. The master gives orders for cold water to be poured on the foreman, then flings 10 rubles in his face. And he takes it, and is pleased too, for indeed he'd be ready to be hanged for 3 rubles, let alone 10. Yes. And on Monday a new gang of workmen arrive. They work, for they have nowhere to go on Saturday. It is the same story over again. The visitor turned over on the other side with his face to the back of the sofa, and muttered something. And here's another instance, Zhmuhin went on. We had the Siberian plague. Here, cattle die off like flies. I can tell you on. The veterinary surgeons came here, and strict orders were given that the dead cattle were to be buried at a distance, deep in the earth, that lime was to be thrown over them. And so on, on scientific principles. My horse died too. I buried it with every precaution, and threw over 300 weight of lime over it. And what do you think, my fine fellows, me precious sons? I mean, dug it up, skinned it, and sold the hide for 3 rubles. There's an instance for you. So people have grown no better, and however you feed a wolf, he will always look towards the forest. There it is. It gives one something to think about. How do you look at it? On one side, a flash of lightning gleamed through a chink in the window blinds. There was the stifling feeling of a storm coming. The gnats were biting, and Zhmuhin, as he lay in his bedroom meditating, sighed and groaned, and said to himself, yes, to be sure. And there was no possibility of getting to sleep. Somewhere far, far away, there was a growl of thunder. Are you asleep? No, answered the visitor. Zhmuhin got up and, thudding with his heels, walked through the parlor and the entry to the kitchen to get a drink of water. The worst thing in the world, is stupidity, he said a little later, coming back with a dipper. My Lyubov Osipovna is on her knees saying her prayers. She prays every night, and bows down to the ground, first that her children may be sent to school. She is afraid her boys will go into the army as simple Cossacks, and that they will be whacked across their backs with sabers. But for teaching one must have money, and where is one to get it? You may break the floor beating your head against it, but if you haven't got it, you haven't. And the other reason she prays is because, every woman imagines there is no one in the world as unhappy as she is. I am a plain-spoken man, and I don't want to conceal anything from you. She comes of a poor family, a village priest's daughter. I married her when she was 17, and they accepted my offer chiefly because they hadn't enough to eat. It was nothing but poverty and misery. While I have anyway land, you see, a farmhand. After all, I am an officer. It was a step up for her to marry me. On the very first day, when she was married, she cried. and she has been crying ever since all these 20 years. She has got a watery eye, and she's always sitting and thinking. And what do you suppose she is thinking about? What can a woman think about? Why, nothing, I must own. I don't consider a woman a human being. The visitor got up abruptly and sat on the bed. Excuse me, I feel stifled, he said. I will go outside. Zhmuhin, still talking about women, drew the bolt in the entry, and they both went out. A full moon was floating in the sky just over the yard, and in the moonlight the house and barn looked whiter than by day, and on the grass brilliant streaks of moonlight, white too, stretched between the black shadows. Far away on the right could be seen the steppe above it. The stars were softly glowing, and it was all mysterious, infinitely far away, as though one were gazing into a deep abyss, while on the left heavy storm clouds, black as soot, were piling up one upon another above the steppe. Their edges were lighted up by the moon, and it looked as though there were mountains there, with white snow on their peaks, dark forests, the sea. There was a flash of lightning, a faint rumble of thunder, and it seemed as though a battle were being fought in the mountains. Quite close to the house, a little night owl screeched monotonously. Asleep, asleep. What time is it now? Asked the visitor. Just after 1. How long it is still to dawn. They went back to the house and lay down again. It was time to sleep, and one can usually sleep so splendidly before rain. But the old man had a hankering after serious, weighty thoughts. He wanted not simply to think, but to meditate, and he meditated how good it would be, as death was near at hand, for the sake of his soul, to give up the idleness which so imperceptibly swallowed up day after day, year after year, leaving no trace to think out for himself, some great exploit, for instance, to walk on foot far, far away, or to give up meat like this young man. And again, he pictured to himself the time when animals would not be killed, pictured it clearly and distinctly, as though he were living through that time himself. But suddenly it was all in a tangle again in his head, and all was muddled. The thunderstorm had passed over, but from the edges of the storm clouds came rain softly pattering on the roof. Zhmuhin got up, stretching and groaning with old age, and looked into the parlor. Noticing that his visitor was not asleep, he said, "When we were in the Caucasus, you know, there was a colonel there who was a vegetarian too. He didn't eat meat, never went shooting, and would not let his servants catch fish, of course. I understand that every animal ought to live in freedom and enjoy its life, only I don't understand how a pig can go about where it likes without being looked after." The visitor got up and sat down. His pale, haggard face expressed weariness and vexation. It was evident that he was exhausted, and only his gentleness and the delicacy of his soul prevented him from expressing his vexation in words. "It's getting light," he said mildly. "Please have the horse brought round for me." "Why so? Wait a little, and the rain will be over." "No, I entreat you," said the visitor in horror with a supplicating voice. "It is essential for me to go at once." And he began hurriedly dressing. By the time the horse was harnessed, the sun was rising. It had just left off raining, the clouds were racing swiftly by, and the patches of blue were growing bigger and bigger in the sky. The first rays of the sun were timidly reflected below in the big puddles. The visitor walked through the entry with his portfolio to get into the trap, and at that moment, Zhmuhin's wife, pale, and it seemed paler than the day before, with tear-stained eyes, looked at him intently without blinking, with the naive expression of a little girl. And it was evident from her dejected face that she was envying him his freedom. Oh, with what joy she would have gone away from there, and she wanted to say something to him, most likely to ask advice about her children. And what a pitiable figure she was! This was not a wife, not the head of a house, not even a servant, but more like a dependent, a poor relation, not wanted by anyone, a nonentity. Her husband, fussing about, talking unceasingly, was seeing his visitor off, continually running in front of him, while she huddled up to the wall with a timid, guilty air, waiting for a convenient minute to speak. "Please come again another time," the old man kept repeating incessantly. "What we have we are glad to offer you." No. The visitor hurriedly got into the trap, evidently with relief, as though he were afraid every minute that they would detain him. The trap lurched about as it had the day before, squeaked, and furiously rattled the pail that was tied on at the back. He glanced round at Zhmuhin with a peculiar expression. It looked as though he wanted to call him a Pechenyeг, as the surveyor had once done, or some such name, but his gentleness got the upper hand. He controlled himself, and said nothing, but in the gateway he suddenly could not restrain himself. He got up and shouted loudly and angrily, "You have bored me to death." And he disappeared through the gate. Near the barn, Zhmuhin's sons were standing. The elder held a gun, while the younger had in his hands a gray cockerel with a bright red Comb the younger flung up the cockerel. With all his might the bird flew upwards higher than the house, and turned over in the air like a pigeon the elder boy fired, and the cockerel fell like a stone. The old man, overcome with confusion, not knowing how to explain the visitor's strange, unexpected shout, went slowly back into the house. And sitting down at the table, he spent a long while meditating on the intellectual tendencies of the day, on the universal immorality, on the telegraph, on the telephone, on velocipedes, on how unnecessary it all was. Little by little he regained his composure, then slowly had a meal, drank 5 glasses of tea, and lay down for a nap.